Assalamu alaikum. So, we have some guests today, and I'm not talking about myself. I'm actually a Southern California native, and I'm excited to be back at UC Irvine. The civil rights lawyer in me wants to remind everyone in this room that everything you say is on the record. And that means if it leaves your lips or fingertips, someone who potentially dislikes Muslims is going to put it on the internet. And may call your employer or your graduate school admissions officer. And I don't say that to scare you, I say it so that you're aware that in addition to the MSU recording this event, there are some guests who are recording this event. And for some reason they think that we are going to be scared of talking our minds and our hearts, or they think that this is going to intimidate me, except I grew up and cut my teeth as an activist post 9/11. When those terror attacks happened, I felt for the first time as an American Muslim unsafe in my skin. Right? We say as American Muslims, particularly in my generation, those of us who are in our 30s, that we were attacked on 9/11 as Americans. We didn't know when the next terror attack would hit. And this hit really close to home for me recently with the attacks in Sri Lanka. Because I was watching the news as I fell asleep, and at that point there had been 6 explosions. And I woke up several hours later and it had increased to 8. And I remembered that feeling from 2001, not knowing what would happen next, not knowing if we had to look over our shoulders, if we were safe on the West Coast as Americans. And then of course as Muslims, right, who share the same faith as the criminals who committed those attacks, we had to look over our shoulders on 9/12 also. I'd been wearing my hijab at that point for nearly 10 years, and I asked myself that day as I went to my college campus, am I safe wearing my hijab? Do I need to look over my shoulder? You may think that times are difficult on college campuses right now, and in fact they are. And they are different in this region. I was just telling someone that in the Bay Area it's different. We don't get stalked at our events. We don't have Islamophobes walking into our events and trying to record us. And so when I leave the blessed, beautiful, diverse Bay Area, which I'll talk about too, I'm reminded that this is the rest of America. And still, consider that in 2001 and 2002, FBI agents would come onto campuses and pull Muslim men out of class. I don't know that that's happened to your MSU in recent years, but back then that was normal, is that you'd be sitting in class and your brother would get yanked out of class because the FBI would just want to question him. And if you weren't in class with him, you'd find out about it at the MSA meeting because that brother wouldn't show up. And maybe he would change campuses. If he was a foreign student, maybe he would leave the country. Not because he was guilty of an actual crime, but because his skin color was suspect. And so I'm excited to be with you. I'm excited that we have guests. It makes me feel special and interesting. They said to me in one of my fellowships, if you say things of consequence, there will be consequences. So we are going to say things of consequence. But before I talk about the issue of oppression, I wanted to check in on you guys, the Muslim students and the other students. How are you doing? It's been a really hard week. And I know that there isn't always time to process. And so does someone want to share how you're feeling? To say it out loud. I'm a verbal processor, so if you let me, I will talk for a full 2 hours. And so instead, I'm curious to hear from the students. How has the news from this weekend hit you? Any volunteers? Yes.
Honestly, it's very sad to hear these kinds of things happen. No matter what place of worship, people should be able to go to their place of worship feeling safe and just a time for them to connect with their God. But in these cases, you're seeing that that's not how the world really works, and people aren't really feeling safe, and we have to take certain measures just to protect the people who are just there.
Others? I could also just stare at you awkwardly. That's okay. The silence can be healing too. I'll tell you that last Wednesday, I heard from a reporter who talked to me about a violent incident with a car in Sunnyvale, California. He said, this person intentionally ran his car into a group of pedestrians. Do you know if it's a hate crime? And I was like, no, I haven't heard anything about it. And over the next couple of days, we followed it. And on Friday afternoon, we got a call from some local officials, and they said, we want to make sure that you know that we are now looking at this like a hate crime. So this man, an Iraq War veteran, intentionally rammed his car into 8 pedestrians in the street in Sunnyvale. They weren't wearing any religious attire. They also weren't at a religious place of observance or anything of that sort. he is alleged to have confessed later that he believed that they were Muslim, that's why he did it. And so I was on the radio this morning talking to Michael Krasny about it, and someone called in, and it turned out it was one of the witnesses. And he said that one of the bodies lay near his car. And, you know, so there were, what we know is that in the group of 8 people, there were some white people, there were some Indian people, and then there were some others. And we know, of course, that white people can be Muslim. And we would, of course, invite that conversation with some of our guests today. We also know that Indian people can be Muslim, but none of these people were. They weren't wearing any religious attire. Several of them were critically injured. One of them is 13, and she is still in a coma. They've had to do brain surgery, do her skull, and a whole bunch of other horrendous things. And in the fallout to hearing about this, I've heard from some Muslims who said, "Oh, am I safe wearing my hijab outside?" Right? And the reality is, I don't know. I don't know if it's safe to wear my hijab outside. What I've said to them is that this girl, this little 13-year-old girl, was not wearing a hijab. She wasn't Muslim. She wasn't going to her mosque. She was near a grocery store. And so the reality of the way hate is happening right now in America is that it's not just about who is actually Muslim, it's also about who is perceived to be Muslim. And that's not new. Post 9/11, one of the first victims of a violent, deadly attack was a Sikh American. Because the people that would attack us don't usually know the difference. And then fast forward to Saturday, and we heard about the synagogue in San Diego and Poway. A gunman opened fire there with the same kind of gun, by the way, that's been used in every major mass shooting in recent months in our country. And he shot at several people, injured several people, and killed one person. And, you know, trigger warning about this part of the story, the person that he killed, her husband, I believe, is a doctor, and so when the call came for help, he went in to administer CPR and to check on the bodies. And he starts to support this woman, and he doesn't realize until a minute later that it's his wife. And his wife dies. The killer confesses in his manifesto that he also engaged in an attempted arson attack at a mosque in San Diego just a few weeks prior. And so I'm reminded that our communities are all under attack together, that this presidential administration that we have, but also that the rhetoric that we're seeing in this country is a white nationalist rhetoric. And it doesn't matter if you're Sunni or Shia, if you're South Asian or Black, if you're Muslim or Jewish, or if you're anything else. And so I appreciate you, and I did not ask for your feedback. If you have feedback, we're happy to take it during the Q&A. The students are, of course, more than welcome to provide feedback, and you should, but that doesn't mean that your guests get to crowd on our space. And it doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Jewish, right? If you are Republican or Democrat, if you look different, if you sound different, if you believe different, you are at risk. And that is what we are facing right now. And so it's heavy. And the thing that I'll tell you is that when I was in college, now a very long time ago, class of 2006 guys, some of you were born at that time, most of you were not. Kidding, all of you were born. We did not get bad news every day in the same way, right? It's not to say that the world has changed very much. Some of these things very much existed back then, but you didn't get a HuffPost alert every time something happened. And you didn't get someone tweeting at you or sending you a screenshot or sending you a message on Instagram. Like, people really shouldn't ruin Instagram with politics. Like, Instagram is for flowers and cats and makeup and cookies, right? Like, that's what's supposed to be about Instagram, not politics. Maybe relationship advice, but not politics. But the reality is we get it on Instagram too. And so we'll talk about oppression, but my biggest concern is that you all be okay, right? And what that means is that you, whether you speak up in this space or you speak up later, that you go through the effort of processing what is going on for you. That you think about what is going on for you, that you get the mental health care that you need to be okay. One of the things that I wish I had started doing when I was in college, when I began my work as an activist, is to go to a therapist, even back then, right? It's something that I do now and I tell people about because I want it to be normal. How many of you drive? So I think every college student in a couple of months will know this story about my dad, but when I started college, I was commuting to Long Beach State, and so my parents gave me my mom's 2000 Toyota Camry. Right? It was 2001, they gave me her Toyota Camry. And I was like, ugh, this is a mom car, right? It's like an old lady car, like why do I have it? Like, I was such a brat. Like, I wasn't just grateful that I had a 1-year-old car that had less than 10,000 miles on it, and it was mine. And anytime, like, you know, like one of my parents would get mad and threaten to take it away, the other parent would be like, no, it's hers, we gave it to her, we can't do that, right? So I drove my 2000 Toyota Camry until 2016. And by the time it retired, it had, the last time I looked at the odometer, it had like 333,000 miles. I specifically remember that number because I wanted the 3333. Like I just wanted the symmetry of that. So I made someone send me a picture because I passed it on to a friend. And then I said, okay, and now I want the picture of 350,000. So I know it made it to 350,000 miles. And the way it made it that far is because it got regular oil changes and tire rotations and all that other good stuff. And I was like 25 at some point, and I had moved out of my house, I was going to law school, then I had a job, and my dad would still call me every few months, be like, did you get the oil change, right? And I'd be like, Daddy, I'm going to. No, but Dad, like your car is not going to last if you don't do this. Why don't you listen to me, right? And this was the conversation, the back and forth. One day he vetted my mechanic. Like I didn't tell him who my mechanic was. He found him on Yelp and called him and talked to him in Urdu. Right, everyone, yes. And then I showed up at the mechanic and you know, Ali is like, your dad called me today. And I was like, my what? What are you talking about? That was how the car lasted to 350,000 miles. What we are experiencing as people of color, as Muslims, as young activists, as people who are targeted both by individuals who, as Aziz Ansari has said, went from being lowercase KKK to uppercase KKK, right? Who are openly, not just white supremacists, but white nationalists, right? And who are willing to be violent in the streets, but also who are willing to exact violence on us through state policy is incredibly taxing, right? Mentally, physically, emotionally. And if you want to do this work, right? I've been in it, like I think of myself as having become an activist on September 13th, 2001. And that's, what now, over 18 years. If you want to last that long and much longer, you'll hear later this week from people who are older than me, though. I do tell them to their face that they're older than me. Right, you'll hear from people who've been in this much longer than me. If you want to last that long, you're going to need to take care of yourselves. And that's going to be different things for different people. And I'll talk about sort of what is the work moving forward, but that's all my ranting about this weekend. I told you I'm a verbal processor, and I haven't seen my therapist since this weekend. So in some ways, you all are also providing a service to me by simply looking at me and not laughing. In organizing for this event, the students asked me to touch on a couple of things. The oppression that we see in Muslim-majority countries today, but also in where Muslims are minorities. The misconceptions that people have on Islam relating to oppression specifically. Islam's view on justice, nonviolent protest and oppression, and then our steps forward, right? The our steps forward is for me because I hate just talking in theory, like I want to tell you something to do. So, you know, in thinking about oppression in other places, I was like, how do I count this, right? Like, where do we see oppression? Give me some ideas. Here in the US. Where else? Where else do we see oppression? Asia, perfect. Be more specific. China, okay. Palestine. Yeah. Middle East. Like different kinds of oppression too, right? And so that was the challenge. The challenge is that the list is long. There is China, right? And in China, what we see is a Muslim minority being oppressed. But there's also Bangladesh, where we see Muslim women being oppressed and facing sexual assault and not getting the help that they need, right? There is India, where you have a prime minister who rode the coattails of his genocidal efforts in Gujarat several decades ago to power. There is Pakistan, right, where we have, for once, not a military dictatorship, but sort of still a corrupt government. There is Palestine, where there is ongoing apartheid, right? I saw an article today, and
there is no Palestine.
Israel,
no Palestine. Democratic
so there
Israel.
Is Palestine.
America friend.
There is Palestine,
No
where the recent elections, sort of marketed themselves around new settlements in the West Bank. And today I saw an article, and I haven't figured out if it's a joke, about the new settlements potentially being named after Donald Trump. I'm really hoping it's an Onion article, but I didn't have a chance to click through. There is Saudi Arabia, of course, right, where we, as American taxpayers, pay Saudi Arabia to leave in place a monarchy, to oppress women and foreign workers, and of course to bomb Yemen. It's funny, people sometimes show up to talks by care leaders and others, and they think that like we only care about Palestine, we only criticize apartheid Israel. It's like, no, we could talk for days about the corruption that is Saudi Arabia, right? Like, I stay awake at night thinking about the fact that my tax dollars pay for the bombing of Yemen. There's Egypt, where we had a military dictatorship for like 40 years. That's so long. I've been at CARE 9.5 years, and sometimes I'm like, at some point they're gonna get rid of me, right? Like, what is my tenure? 40 years? Like, when did he start when he was 12? Like, how does he have, anyways. There's Egypt. There is Syria, right? There is Syria. All these countries on the brink of a humanitarian crisis. We sometimes forget to talk about Mali and other places in Africa where Muslims are also suffering, right? There is Europe, where under the guise of secularism, religious practice has been necessarily barred, right? So the idea in many places in Europe is that women are oppressed, so we can't let them cover, and the exact opposite is that then we must force them to uncover. And then of course there is the US, right, where we are. And the difficult tension for me a lot of times as an American is, as a Muslim, right, someone who looks like I'm not from here, even though I was born and raised here, and if someone here tells me to go home, I'll tell them, hey, yeah, Southern California is home, I'm excited to be back. But I'm expected to explain oppression in other places, right, as though I have any culpability in it. But what I carry, like the guilt of, like the real responsibility of, as an American, is the oppression that happens right here, right? Because I'm paying for this. People say, well, why don't you speak out about what is happening in Saudi Arabia? And I'm like, because I have no influence in Saudi Arabia, like none. But as an American, I have influence here, right? At best, my influence in Saudi Arabia is how my taxpayer dollars go there. Why don't you speak out about what happens in Bangladesh? Because I know nothing about Bangladesh, but what I do know about is the prison industrial complex in the United States, right? What I do know about is America is one of the major forces in the climate disaster that's coming. What I do know about is that if you go to school in South Central LA, you get different resources than you do if you go to school in Huntington Beach, or in Irvine, or in Laguna Niguel, or in any of these nicer areas. What I'm responsible for is right here. One of my teachers once reminded us as we were talking through the exhaustion of activism is that we all have these like really big circles of concern, right? Like I'm concerned about so much stuff. I'm concerned about healthcare and welfare and education funding and prison reform and all of these things. And it's exhausting. It's so exhausting, right? How many of you walk around just tired all the time from the bad news? A couple of you, I've seen some nods, but you don't need to raise your hands, right? Like I bet it's like that. Like every time I look to my phone, it's like, oh, what now? Do you know that there was a terror plot that was thwarted in LA today? Yeah, and that's my job, is keeping track of all of the bad news. Now we don't know anything about the terror plot, and we're waiting to see what happens and whether or not, well, we can talk about FBI entrapment, right? But like what the FBI's role was in that terror plot. But the reality is like there are people that are scared, right? So it was like Friday we found out about a hate crime in Sunnyvale. Saturday we found out about the synagogue in San Diego. Sunday we found out that the synagogue shooter was the mosque arsonist, and on Monday there's a terror plot thwarted. So our teacher says to us, you can only do so much, right? So focus on what you can influence. And so they asked me to talk about oppression elsewhere, and here's what I'll tell you about oppression elsewhere. It happens. Absolutely it happens. If someone says to you, Islam is really great on women's rights, I would say absolutely, Islam is really great on women's rights, which is why I practice Islam. If someone were to say to you, Saudi Arabia is really good on women's rights, I would say, no, it's not. That's why I don't live there. If they were to say to you that like Islam supports democracy, that Islam is cohesive with democracy, I would say, yes, I agree. And if they said Egypt is a democratic state, I would say, no, clearly not. That's why I don't live there. Right? And so I'm not going to tell you that oppression doesn't exist elsewhere. I'm not even going to say to you that Muslims don't engage in oppression. One of our other teachers, Dr. Hatem, who has visited this campus before, says sometimes, people ask him, like, does racism exist in the Muslim community? He's like, yeah, the Muslim community is no exception to humanity, right? The things that we say exist everywhere else exist in our communities too. And we absolutely should work to eradicate them, right? Like, I don't want us to say, hey, they don't exist, because that's dishonest to ourselves, it's dishonest to our critics, with their cute 1990s camcorders, and it doesn't move us forward. It's not a truthful conversation. I wish someone would get them cell phones so they could live stream. Better for my viewership online. So that exists. Is it justified in the religion? No. But is the religion used as a tool to justify it? Yes. In the same way that capitalism is used as a tool, in the same way that Christianity is used as a tool, right? Every